In March 1925, in a courtroom of the King's Bench Division, the Countess of Carnarvon stood under cross-examination while a young barrister named Norman Burkett laid out, line by line, the sums she had paid to a soldier while he was still married to another woman. The press galleries were packed. Just 2 years earlier, her first husband had died in a Cairo hotel room, days after opening the tomb of Tutankhamun. She had inherited one of the largest private fortunes in England, mothered the future 6th Earl of Carnarvon, and turned her ancestral home into one of the finest officers' hospitals of the First World War. By the time she died in 1969, she had been declared bankrupt, dropped by Queen Mary, and reduced to a small terraced house in Bristol. How did the illegitimate daughter of a Rothschild banker come to rule Highclere Castle, one of the grandest houses in Edwardian England, and seat its Prince of Wales at her own table? And what destroyed her so completely that history, even with her name on the deeds, very nearly forgot she had existed at all? Almina Victoria Maria Alexandra Wombwell was born in Paris on the 14th of August, 1876. Her birth certificate names her mother as Marie Félicité Boyer, a French woman of modest background, and her father as Captain Frederick Charles Wombwell, an English officer from a minor aristocratic family. The document is, in almost every meaningful sense, a fiction. Captain Wombwell had separated from Marie Boyer years before Almina's birth, and observers in both London and Paris understood perfectly well that the child belonged to another man. That man was Alfred de Rothschild, second son of Baron Lionel de Rothschild and a director of the Bank of England. Alfred remained a confirmed bachelor all his life, a connoisseur of art and music, and one of the wealthiest men in Britain. He kept Marie Boyer as his long-term mistress in a Paris apartment and visited her regularly through the 1870s. No surviving letter, no signed admission, no scrap of legal paper confirms his paternity in writing. The evidence rests on something more durable than ink: money. Alfred funded Almina's education, paid for her clothes and her introduction into London society, and in the end left her to the bulk of his £5 million estate when he died in 1918. Almina herself grew up in a peculiar position. By legal definition, she was the daughter of a country gentleman of no particular wealth. In social terms, she lived as the petted favorite of one of the richest men in the country. She spent part of her childhood with her mother in France, then moved within Rothschild circles in London, where she received the upbringing of an heiress while carrying the name of a man who had nothing to do with her. The arrangement raised few eyebrows for the period. Wealthy bachelors of the late Victorian era frequently kept mistresses and quietly provided for their illegitimate children, and society, when it spoke of such things at all, spoke in code. Almina remained a Wombwell on paper, a Rothschild in everything that mattered. Her name itself carried a hidden message. Almina, an Arabic-derived name beloved of Alfred de Rothschild, was his choice for the child, in the careful idiom of the period, almost a signature. By the time she came of age in the 1890s, she had beauty, a continental polish, and the unspoken backing of one of the largest fortunes in Europe. What she did not have was a title, and in the marriage market of late Victorian England, that absence weighed more than anything else. To understand the marriage that followed, you have to understand the financial crisis facing the British aristocracy in the closing decades of the 19th century. Agricultural depression had hollowed out the rents of the great estates, and many of the old families found themselves cash poor while sitting on enormous crumbling country houses they could no longer afford to heat. The solution for those willing to swallow their pride was to marry money. American heiresses flooded into London in search of titles. New money chased old blood. The arrangement it acquired its own vocabulary, and the marriages it produced were, for all the orange blossom and white lace, fundamentally commercial transactions. George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, was 30 years old in 1895 and possessed of all the assets and liabilities of his class. He held Highclere Castle, a vast Neo-Elizabethan pile in Hampshire, designed by Charles Barry, and he carried the social standing of an ancient earldom. Alongside these came ruinous debts, expensive tastes, a passion for fast cars and slow horses, and a constitution wrecked in a motor accident 2 years earlier. The Earl charmed easily, thought sharply, and did not possess a penny he could spare. What he needed was a wife with money, The introduction came through a mutual acquaintance, and Alfred de Rothschild moved quickly to negotiate the settlement. Newspapers reported the match as a love affair, and there may well have been genuine affection between the young Earl and the 19-year-old Almina. But the terms of the marriage settlement, drawn up with meticulous care by Rothschild solicitors, leave little doubt about the underlying nature of the arrangement. They married on the 26th of June, 1895, at St. Margaret's, Westminster. The bride wore white satin. Behind the scenes, a fortune changed hands. Popular accounts have long described Almina's dowry as a lump sum of £500,000. The truth was more elaborate and far cleverer. Alfred de Rothschild paid £150,000 directly to clear the fifth Earl's existing debts, a sum equivalent to perhaps £20 million today. Of the remaining £500,000, the bulk took the form of a trust covenant, a binding legal promise that the full amount would pass to the trustees of Almina's marriage settlement on Rothschild's death. In the meantime, she drew an annual allowance of £12,000 for life. Generosity, in the conventional sense, had nothing to do with it. The structure existed to protect the principal, to ensure that none of the Rothschild capital could be touched by Carnarvon creditors during Alfred's lifetime, and that Almina herself, not her husband, held the purse strings. On the marriage itself, the effect was immediate and lasting. The fifth Earl entered the union with the public dignity of his title intact, but in private, he depended on his wife, financially, in a way few aristocratic husbands of the period would have tolerated. At Highclere, the conventional Victorian pairing of an authoritative husband and a deferential wife managing the household bore no resemblance to what actually went on. Almina paid the bills. Almina commissioned the renovations. Almina decided who came to the shooting parties. The Earl had his title, his collections, his Egyptian dreams. His wife held the checkbook that funded all of it. The Highclere Almina, inherited as a young countess, was a place of faded grandeur. Charles Barry's neo-Elizabethan masterpiece, completed in the 1840s, stood structurally sound but technologically primitive. No electricity reached the principal rooms. Plumbing from the middle of the century was inadequate for the demands of a modern country house. The rooms were stuffed with treasures, but decades of underspending had left everything shabby. Almina set about remaking the place with the energy of a woman who had nothing to prove and unlimited funds with which to prove it anyway. Electric lighting went in throughout the principal floors. Bathrooms multiplied. The kitchens were modernized, and the staff quarters expanded to house the army of servants required for the kind of entertaining she had in mind. Architects, gardeners, decorators, a household staff swollen to imperial size. She refilled the wine cellars and restocked the gun rooms. Within a few years, Highclere, under Almina Carnarvon, was the kind of place where cabinet ministers and royal princes came for the weekend shoot and stayed for the political conversation. The shooting parties passed into legend, even by the lavish standards of Edwardian country house entertaining. Edward VII, and still Prince of Wales, attended frequently. Bags of pheasant and partridge ran into the thousands per weekend. Almina, an exacting hostess, arranged everything from the bedroom assignments to the seating at dinner, and women who privately resented her ambiguous origins admired her competence in spite of themselves. 2 children set the seal on the marriage. Henry, called Porchy, the future 6th Earl, arrived in 1898, and Evelyn followed 3 years later. The marriage itself worked, by the conventions of the period, as a successful one. Almina and the 5th Earl shared interests in horses, in art collecting, and in the small pleasures of country life. They were no inseparable couple in the modern sense. Her husband spent more and more time abroad, particularly in Egypt, where the dry climate suited his ruined lungs, and where he had developed a passion for ancient artifacts. Almina, for her part, remained the unchallenged mistress of Highclere and the manager of its enormous expenses. Both arrangements seemed to have suited them. Whether either of them stayed strictly faithful is another question, and one the surviving records do not answer with any certainty. What is certain is that the financial engine driving the whole enterprise ran on Rothschild money. The shooting parties, the renovations, the Egyptian expeditions, the lives of the children and the servants and the horses, all of it depended on the annual £12 allowance and the periodic top-ups Alfred provided whenever a particular project demanded them. None of it was Carnarvon money. The family lived like medieval magnates on the income of a Jewish banker who could never quite be acknowledged at his own daughter's table. When war broke out in the summer of 1914, Almina was 38, the mother of two teenage children, and the chatelaine of a great country house. She might have been forgiven for retreating into the private comforts of her position. Instead, she did the thing her family would cite ever afterwards in defense of her memory. She converted Highclere Castle into a hospital for wounded officers, and she did it with such speed and efficiency that the first patients arrived within weeks of the declaration of war. The popular version of this story, recycled in countless magazine articles and television adaptations, presents Almina as a kind of Edwardian Florence Nightingale who bandaged wounds, comforted dying soldiers, and labored alongside the medical staff with serene grace. The reality, though less romantic, was in some ways more impressive. Almina was no nurse by any meaningful standard. She was an administrator, and a very good one. The kind of woman who could turn a country house into a working military hospital inside a fortnight. Backed by Rothschild capital, she hired the best surgeons in London, and she paid them properly. She recruited qualified matrons and trained nursing staff at her own expense. She installed operating theaters at Highclere and stocked them with equipment that exceeded the standard of many official military hospitals. When demand for beds outgrew the space available, she opened a second hospital at 48 Bryanston Square in London, again funded entirely from her own resources. These were not gestures of patriotic sentiment. They were professionally run medical facilities, and they saved lives that would otherwise have been lost in the chaos of the war's first casualties. What Almina herself contributed to the daily medical work was supervision and a certain emotional warmth. She moved through the wards, talked to the officers, wrote letters to their families, and kept the place running on time. She was the matron in spirit, if not in qualification, the senior officer who arranges everything and intimidates everyone. Soldiers convalescing at Highclere remembered her as kind, capable, somewhat alarming in her efficiency, and quite incapable of tolerating nonsense from anyone. The combination was, perhaps, exactly what the situation required. Alfred de Rothschild died in January 1918, 10 months before the war ended. His will, predictably, left Almina the residue of his enormous estate, a fortune valued at roughly £1.5 million, equivalent to well over £100 million today. The trust covenant from 1895 was activated, and the principal passed to her trustees. For the first time in her life, Almina was not merely the well-funded mistress of someone else's house. She belonged, in her own right, to the small circle of the wealthiest women in England. The timing was awful. Within 5 years, the wealth that had insulated her from every difficulty of her life would draw her into the most destructive scandal she ever faced. The 5th Earl of Carnarvon's interest in Egyptology had begun, as so much of his life had, almost by accident. The motor accident of 1901, which left his lungs permanently damaged, forced him to seek warmer winters abroad, and he settled on Egypt as the kindest climate for his condition. What began as a convalescence became an obsession. He took up the financing of archaeological excavations in the Valley of the Kings. He partnered with the English archaeologist Howard Carter, a man of difficult temperament but extraordinary skill, and together they spent years digging in increasingly unpromising patches of desert. Almina financed much of the work from London, watching her husband's hobby consume an ever larger share of her annual income. By the autumn of 1922, the partnership stood on the edge of collapse. Carnarvon, exasperated by years of expensive failure, told Carter that the coming season would be the last he would fund. Carter persuaded him to extend the work for one final attempt. On the 4th of November, 1922, a workman struck a step cut into the rock floor of a hitherto unexcavated corner of the valley. Within weeks, Carter and Carnarvon stood together at the sealed doorway of a tomb that had lain undisturbed for more than 3,000 years. The chamber beyond held gold-painted chests, chariots, and the funerary goods of a forgotten pharaoh whose name had survived only an obscure king. Lists! They had found Tutankhamun. The discovery sent the world's press into a frenzy that lasted for months. Reporters from a dozen countries descended on Luxor in numbers that overwhelmed serious excavation and forced Carter to barricade the entrance against journalists who tried to get in at night. Almina and her daughter Evelyn traveled out to Egypt to see the tomb. Photographed at the site in furs and pearls, Almina appeared on front pages from London to Sydney. Behind the public glamour, though, the practical situation was already going wrong. Lord Carnarvon, trying to control the chaos, had sold exclusive reporting rights to the Times of London. Every other newspaper in the world, locked out of the most important story of the decade, looked for a way to compete. They found one within months, and the form their competition took would attach itself permanently to Almina's family name. In the early months of 1923, Lord Carnarvon was in poor health. The Egyptian climate that had once preserved him now wore him out. He had a habit of nicking insect bites with his razor while shaving, and one such nick on a mosquito bite on his cheek became infected. The infection spread. Pneumonia followed. He was moved to the Continental Savoy Swell in Cairo, where the medical care was the best in the country. Almina, alerted to the seriousness of his condition, traveled out from England with her son Henry. She arrived in time to be with him at the end. George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, died at the Continental Savoy on the morning of the 5th of April, 1923. He was 56. The cause of death was blood poisoning leading to pneumonia, a perfectly ordinary medical conclusion in an era before antibiotics. He had survived the war, the strain of the dig, and decades of fragile health, only to be killed by an insect in a hotel room. The body was returned to England and buried on the grounds of Highclere. Almina, who had walked through a dozen national tragedies in the past 9 years, was a widow at 46. The journalists who had been locked out of the Times exclusives saw their opening. Arthur Weigel, an Egyptologist and former antiquities official writing for the Daily Mail, popularized the idea that the tomb had been protected by an ancient curse. Within hours, the story had spread. Marie Corelli, the popular novelist, had already published warnings about disturbing the dead. Reports circulated that the lights of Cairo had flickered on the night of the Earl's death. Others claimed his dog, back at Highclere, had howled at the moment of his passing. None of these details survived serious examination, and the curse itself, as Egyptologists have patiently explained for a century, was a media fabrication designed to generate competing headlines. The fabrication worked. In the global imagination, the curse of the Pharaohs took its place as one of the founding myths of modern occult journalism, where, despite 100 years of patient academic correction, it remains. Almina's response to the curse stories was characteristically practical. She went on financing Howard Carter's work for several more years, ensuring that the contents of the tomb were properly recorded and preserved. Then, in 1925, she made a decision that severed her family's connection to Tutankhamun forever. She formally relinquished all claim to the tomb's artifacts to the Egyptian government in exchange for a compensation grant of between 35,000 and 36,000 pounds. The agreement was the official end of the Carnarvon involvement in the dig. By the time it was signed, Almina was already entangled in a scandal that would destroy everything the discovery had built. Almina did not stay a widow for long. In December 1923, only 8 months after her first husband's death in Cairo, she married Lieutenant Colonel Ian Onslow Dennisdown, a cavalry officer of distinguished service and conspicuously little money. The speed of the remarriage shocked even her tolerant friends. Lord Carnarvon's body was barely cold, and his widow, one of the wealthiest women in England, had taken a second husband whose chief qualification appeared to be that he was available. Denniston was an officer of long service and conspicuous charm. He had served through the South African War and the First World War and emerged with a respectable record. By 1923, though, his private life lay in the kind of disorder the British Army of the period preferred to keep out of the newspapers. His first marriage to Dorothy Dennisdown had collapsed years earlier, but the precise legal and financial arrangements between them had never been formally resolved. He had promised Dorothy support, and the support had not in any reliable way materialized. When Almina entered the picture, the unresolved obligations to the first Mrs. Dennisdown came with her new husband as part of the package. The pattern of Almina's second marriage looked uncomfortably like the pattern of her first, with one telling difference. Where she had once funded an earl's debts in exchange for a coronet, she now funded a colonel's debts in exchange for nothing of equivalent social weight. Aristocratic London noticed. The court of King George V noticed. and quiet doors began to close in the Mayfair drawing rooms where the Carnarvon name had once been universally welcome. Queen Mary, already a woman of strict views on the propriety of widowhood, watched Almina's haste with a chill that everyone around her felt. 2 more years would pass before the social consequences landed in a courtroom. In March 1925, Dorothy Denniston filed suit against her former husband in the King's Bench Division of the High Court of Justice. The action, technically a claim for maintenance arrears under a 1921 deed of separation, in practical terms struck at Almina's money. Ian Denniston himself had no resources to speak of, while his new wife had everything. Almina was the target. The trial that followed ran on the front pages of every London paper for weeks. Norman Burkett, then a young barrister at the start of what would become a famous career, led for Dorothy. Almina was called as a witness on her husband's behalf, and what followed was a quietly devastating cross-examination that legal observers would discuss for years. Burkett, working methodically through documents and bank statements, established a sequence of facts that no amount of aristocratic dignity could soften. Almina had paid Ian Denniston's debts before their marriage and had gone on advancing him money throughout the courtship. She had supported him while he was still technically the husband of another woman. The financial relationship between Almina and Ian Denniston, in other words, had begun while Lord Carnarvon was still alive, and while Dorothy Denniston was still owed maintenance. Newspapers reported every detail. The Times, normally restrained in its coverage of society scandal, ran the trial as front-page news for the duration of the hearings. Popular papers like the Daily Mail showed less restraint. Society readers across the empire followed the cross-examinations with the appalled fascination usually reserved for divorce cases of the truly disreputable. Almina, who had spent 30 years carefully maintaining the social position her Rothschild money had purchased in 1895, watched it dissolve in a fortnight of testimony. The jury found largely in Dorothy's favor. Damages, legal costs, and the settlement of a related breach of promise suit on Ian's behalf cost Almina an estimated £40,000, a sum that even a Rothschild heiress noticed. Money was the smaller half of the disaster. Social ruin made up the larger half. Queen Mary, who had never warmed to Almina, used the trial as the occasion to drop her completely. Invitations to court ceased. Names were quietly removed from lists. Carnarvon hospitality, once the center of Edwardian political society, now sat outside the circle entirely. Almina was 48. 2 children, a second husband, and a fortune still belonged to her, but the social position those things had been meant to buy was gone for good. The decade after the Denniston trial passed, on the surface, as a period of attempted recovery. Almina threw her energy into a new project, a private nursing home in London called Alfred House, named for the man who had founded her fortune. In conception, it was an extension of the hospital work she had done at Highclere during the war. She wanted to provide a high standard of medical care for paying patients, drawing on her contacts among the best surgeons in London. The idea was sound. The execution would prove disastrous. Almina had never in her entire life been required to balance a budget. The Rothschild capital had always cushioned every overspend, every renovation, every shooting party that ran over its costs. Running a hospital as a paying business demanded exactly the kind of financial discipline she had never been forced to learn. Alfred House lost money steadily. The care remained high, the staff were paid well, the rooms were beautifully furnished, and none of it was matched by income enough to sustain the place. She poured more and more of the Rothschild residue into the institution to keep it afloat. The capital, vast as it was, had limits. Her second was no help. Ian Denniston, broken in health and reputation by the 1925 trial, declined steadily through the late 1920s and early 1930s. He died in 1938, leaving Almina a widow for the second time. By then, the fortune that had once placed her the wealthiest women in the country had been seriously diminished, and the Rothschild jewels were beginning to find their way into the auction rooms. Alfred House went on consuming capital. Almina went on living as though her income matched her expenditure, and it did not. The 6th Earl of Carnarvon, her son Henry, watched the decline with the helpless fascination of a child who had grown up assuming his mother's wealth was infinite. He had inherited Highclere on his father's death in 1923, but the estate itself was perpetually short of cash. His own private life, marked by multiple marriages and his own romantic indiscretions, was no model of financial responsibility. Henry could not have rescued his mother even if she had asked him to. Her pride would not let her ask. The iron pride of a woman who had once entertained the Prince of Wales did not bend to fundraising appeals to her own son. By the late 1940s, Almina was selling jewelry. The famous Rothschild collection, which Alfred had assembled over a lifetime of connoisseurship, was being broken up piece by piece to pay current expenses. Art, porcelain, and silver that had once filled her rooms in Mayfair left the house in unmarked vans. Friends who visited remarked, with the careful pity the English upper class reserved for such situations, that the place felt emptier than it once had. The Rothschild residue, the fortune meant to last for generations, was running out. In 1951, at the age of 75, Almina was officially declared bankrupt. Notice of the bankruptcy appeared in the London Gazette, the same publication that had once announced her late husband's appointments and her own court presentations. Legally speaking, the humiliation was undeserved, since the original fortune had been more than enough to support a reasonable life for several lifetimes. What she had lacked was not capital, it was restraint. The £1.5 million Alfred de Rothschild had left her in 1918, a sum that should have kept her in comfort to the end of a long life, had been consumed by hospitals, lawsuits, weddings, renovations, charities, and a sustained refusal to live within any income at all. Her last years passed in conditions that would have been unimaginable to the young countess who had presided over Highclere with the Prince of Wales as a regular weekend guest. Bristol became home, a modest terraced house where she lived with her devoted housekeeper. The famous beauty had faded into the round, kindly face of a very old woman. The voice that had once ordered cabinet ministers to dinner now ordered tea from a small kitchen. A small allowance from her son was supplemented with what little remained of her own assets. She read, she received the occasional visitor, and she waited. Almina Victoria Maria Alexandra Womwell, Countess of Carnarvon, died on the 8th of May, 1969, at Frenchay Hospital in Bristol. She was 92. Her estate was valued at probate at less than £3,000, less than she had once spent on a single weekend's entertainment at Highclere. She had outlived her second husband by 31 years, her first by 46, and Alfred de Rothschild by 51. Her own social position had ended nearly half a century before she did. The obituaries were brief. The Times, which had covered her every appearance for 30 years, gave her a short notice summarizing her marriages, her son, and her connection to the Tutankhamun discovery. Of the Dennistoun trial, no mention. Of the bankruptcy, no mention. Even the Rothschild paternity, which had defined every circumstance of her life, from birth to grave, went unrecorded. She was buried beside her first husband on the grounds of Highclere, in the small private chapel where the Carnarvons of 3 generations had been laid to rest. She had returned in death to the only place that had ever fully belonged to her. In 2011, Almina re-entered public consciousness by a route nobody could have predicted. The television series Downton Abbey, which used Highclere Castle as its principal filming location, had become a global sensation. Fiona Herbert, the 8th Countess of Carnarvon and the wife of Almina's great-grandson, wrote a book called Lady Almina and the Real Downton Abbey. The publication coincided with the height of the Downton phenomenon, and it was marketed as the true story of the woman whose castle had inspired the fictional Crawley family. The book was an authorized family history drawn from the Highclere archives, and it read as a competent account of Almina's hospital work and her management of the castle. It also amounted, by any reasonable standard, to an exercise in deliberate sanitization. The Dennistoun trial was handled with great delicacy. The bankruptcy was barely mentioned. As for the Rothschild paternity, which the family had spent a century quietly acknowledging in private, it was treated with the discretion of a hostess deflecting an awkward dinner guest. The Almina of the 8th Countess's book became the Almina the family wished her to be, a wartime heroine, a devoted wife, a benevolent chatelaine, a Rothschild only by quiet implication. The Almina, who had been cross-examined by Norman Burkett in 1925, went largely missing from the pages. The marketing parallel to Cora Crawley, the fictional American heiress of the series, was both a clever commercial strategy and a piece of historical misdirection. Cora Crawley, played by Elizabeth McGovern, is a sanitized ideal, an heiress without scandal, a wife without litigation, a mother without complications, a creation pasted onto a real woman's castle. Almina fit none of those descriptions. Her life had played out as a public scandal, her finances had been pulled apart in open court, and her social position had been destroyed by her own decisions. The fictional character borrowed her castle and her dowry. Everything else was somebody else's invention. The other major biography, William Cross's The Life and Secrets of Almina Carnarvon, was published the same year and took the opposite approach. Cross drew on legal records, bankruptcy notices, and contemporary newspaper coverage, and produced a portrait that returned to the scandal at every turn. His book also gave serious attention to Edwardian society gossip that Henry, the sixth Earl, was biologically the son of Prince Victor Duleep Singh, a rumor with no documentary support that, in all likelihood, belongs in the same category as the curse of Tutankhamun. The Cross biography is required reading for the public record. It is not, however, a balanced account, and its tabloid tone is its own kind of distortion. The accurate picture lies somewhere between the two books, in the unedited mess of a life that resists easy summary. Almina was neither the saint of the family hagiography nor the schemer of the critical expose. She was a woman of considerable competence and considerable folly, born into one of the strangest social positions of her age, given more money than was good for her, and dropped into a world that had no idea where to place her. She did extraordinary things during the war, and disastrous things followed. 92 years of life have left her remembered, when she is remembered at all, for the wrong reasons. The physical traces of her life lie scattered. Highclere Castle still stands in Hampshire, and the rooms she renovated with Rothschild money are open to visitors who arrive expecting Lady Cora and find instead the faint outline of a more complicated original. The hospital wards she set up in 1914 are gone, but the surviving records, preserved in the estate archive, document the work with a precision the popular accounts have rarely matched. Her grave in the private chapel sits beside her first husband. The terraced house in Bristol is an ordinary suburban home now, and the people who live there do not always know that an English countess once died within its walls. All £1.5 million of Alfred's money is gone. Auction catalogues from the 1940s and 1950s contain her jewelry, scattered piece by piece across the post-war art market. The shooting parties have receded into the haze of pre-war photographs. Transcripts of the Dennistoun trial sit in the National Archives at Kew, available to any researcher patient enough to find them. And the Tutankhamun artifacts she relinquished to the Egyptian government in 1925 are now in the Grand Egyptian Museum near the Pyramids of Giza, where they belong. The £35,000 compensation grant that ended the Carnarvon claim closed a chapter that had begun with such triumph in 1922. What has not survived, and what is almost impossible to reconstruct, is the texture of her interior life. Almina left no published memoir, no body of letters meant for posterity, no diary that has come down to us in any organized form. The personal voice that might have told us what she thought of Alfred de Rothschild, of the fifth Earl, of Ian Dennistoun, of the courtroom in 1925, of the bankruptcy in 1951, of the long, quiet years in Bristol is missing. We have her actions, her bank statements, her marriages, her hospitals, her lawsuits. The woman behind them remains in the ways that matter most, a stranger to us. That absence, in the end, suits the woman herself. The Edwardian world she belonged to was built on careful silences, and Almina, for all her public scandals, remained an Edwardian to the core. She never explained herself in print, and she never gave the press the satisfaction of a confession. Newspaper interviews and confessional memoirs were not, in her lifetime, the tools of a Rothschild heiress. She took her secret with her into the chapel at Highclere, where she lies beside the man whose title she had once bought with her father's money. Tell me in the comments which detail changed the way you see this story. I read every single comment. Subscribe to the Royal Thread. Every story is connected. And the next thread is already being pulled.